Okay, so it looks like we are rolling. Well, howdy there, Internet people. It's Bo again. So today we're going to talk a little bit about science fiction. We are going to talk about how it influences societal change, and we're going to talk about the Orville. And I have a guest with me who is definitely the person to ask when it comes to all of this. So I'm going to allow Jessie here to introduce herself.
Hi. Hello. My name is Jessie Earl. A lot of people know me as Jessie Gender on YouTube. I am a huge, gigantic dork, is what I like to introduce myself as. But yeah, I do YouTube stuff just like you, and I talk about mainly social and political issues through nerddoms and geekdoms, most notably about LGBTQ issues and trans issues because I am trans and also bisexual. So I like to focus on those issues, but just try to talk about kind of the same things that you talk about, but just through a nerdy lens because that's who I am.
And it shows. So this whole episode was prompted because I got just a flood of messages asking about the Orville, and particularly one episode in particular. So I hadn't seen any of the series, so I went back
Mm,
and watched the entire series in like a week,
dang, that's impressive.
and and then I recorded my interpretation of what I saw, and I thought I had a pretty good handle on it. And then I did this horrible thing, and I watched your video, and I realized that you might be a little bit more nuanced with the nerdy. So figured rather than reinvent the wheel, we could just bring you on.
Well, I am honored because I'm always a big fan of your work. And isn't that always also like the YouTuber problem? You're like, I'm going to make this video. It's going to be great. And then you watch someone else do a much better job. It's like, well, I don't know why I'm here all the time.
Right. I mean, in when I watched it, I saw, from that very first storyline, and I think maybe it was because I knew how the storyline progressed. But when it first started, I looked at it as here's this person who early on they identified as being outside of the societal rules when it comes to gender. So that was just how I took it, was that they forced the child to stay within those rules. Watching yours, you brought up this whole other topic. So why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting discussion when it comes to Orville because it kind of hits on a confluence of a bunch of different things in terms of like talking about how we represent things through science fiction allegory and things like that. And the most notable one to me, because I started watching the Orville when it came out, was actually less talking about like transgender issues and even LGBTQ issues in general when we talk about sexuality, but intersex issues. Which, if you don't know what intersex is, essentially it is in our society today, we are in human species because we're talking about aliens here. We're born male and female mostly, with people with XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, and other things too that can influence like how we're perceived, like hormonal levels, whether it makes you taller, skinnier, whether you have big breasts, no breasts, all those things are influenced by a bunch of different things, but we tend to, equate it down to hormones. But there are, sorry, chromosomes. But then intersex people are people that are born sort of outside those sort of two poles. So you'll get people who are born with XXY chromosomes, for example. You'll also get people who are born with hormonal imbalances. Maybe they'll have XXY chromosomes, but their hormones will be different. So they'll develop different genitals or they'll develop different body features, things like that. And for the most part, people that are born that way can live full, happy, productive lives. Some may have to have medical issues that are dealt with when they're born, but they'll be they'll be medically fine for the most part. However, what the Orville touched upon with character Topa in the early episode was the fact that a lot of intersex people, because we sort of have this society where we sort of say, oh, everyone needs to be male or female and aligned with these sort of norms that we have, a lot of intersex kids will sometimes have surgeries done to them when they're young, either by their doctor or by the parents, or typically chosen by both, to sort of make them align with one or the other. And that's usually because they're babies, obviously done without their consent or knowledge. And oftentimes, many intersex people, when they grow up, don't even know that it happened. And that's something that was reflected with the character of Topa, that this was a character who within the society of the Mocklins, which is the alien species in the show, all those alien species are born male. And I don't think there's a specific number given, but like generally, at least perceived by the culture, most Mocklins are born as guys. And so women are considered to be intersex in their society. By human standards, not the same way, but within their society, females would be considered intersex. And so they have the whole storyline where they sort of force Topa to undergo a surgery as a kid without her consent, that forces her into being and presenting as a male. They don't say specifically, but presumably they sort of shape her body to have particular genitals. So
Okay.
I know it's a long-winded explanation.
No. Especially for people who haven't seen the show, that's probably very helpful. And then from there, it brings us to the episode that everybody is talking about, A Tale of Two Topas. And so tell us what happens in that.
Yeah. So in at this point, the character had only been intersex, and we had seen the character of Topa come up a few times because this is an alien show, even though it's 3 seasons, they've aged to like 14 years old in 3 years. Because welcome to science fiction. But they've had some issues with like dealing with masculinity and having violent outbursts and things like that when they were younger, and through a couple episodes. But when we hit A Tale of Two Topas, the storyline suddenly becomes about Topa now feeling that she doesn't really fit into how she's been told to be. At this point, she doesn't know that she's intersex, that she had the surgery done to her, but she's feeling something's off. And I'm saying she now, but at the time, she thinks she's a guy, uses he/him pronouns. And through a sort of series of events of the episode, she comes to realize, oh, I had this surgery done to me. I don't feel like I'm a boy, and I wish to reverse the procedure that was done to me to be seen as not only just be seen as a woman, but also have my body align with being a woman, and getting to live that life and identify in that gender. And so this is actually where, and we can get into the nitty gritty of all of this. Up until this point, she was not transgender, even though when she was a kid, she had her body changed against her will. That's not being trans. Trans is when you have been told to be something by society. In this case, for Topa, she was told that she was a guy, and they had a surgery to make her do that. But then you sort of realize that doesn't fit you, and you sort of choose to transition in whatever way, shape, or form that is, whether it be through surgeries or it be through just asking for things like pronouns or dressing differently. It can be a myriad of these different things, mix and match. For her, it was a surgery. And that led her to be perceived as a woman. So now she is a trans character on top of being an intersex character.
Okay. So is there, one of the things that has made this episode so talked about is the various takes that different groups have had. Do you see anything at all in this episode or in this storyline that could be taken as being anti-trans?
Yeah, because I was kind of hinting at it there, and this is sort of what gets confusing when we talk about alien metaphor, right? Is that a lot of people equate the act of just having surgery or like something being done to your body, when it comes to sex or gender, to instantly being trans. And so because she had this surgery done to her as a kid against her will, people equated that with being seen as that's being trans, right? Like, oh, you're trans because you had this surgery done to you. And now that she's older and she's getting it reversed, it's saying like, oh, this society transed her as a child, and now she's reversing it. And so many people took that as being like, oh, this is the show saying you shouldn't force gender upon this kid, that you shouldn't like force gender ideology upon this child, when that's not really, it's not really what being trans is. Because, and again, it gets confusing when we talk about this within the world of the Orville, because there's sort of this added layer of alienness to it. But when we talk about intersex, when we talk about transness, the whole point of being trans is you're told to exist one way. Oh, did I just get dropped? Oh, there we go.
No, you're good. Okay, I don't know what is going on there.
I'll wait until should I just keep going? Or?
Yeah, just keep going. It'll bounce back, I'm sure.
Okay.
I hope.
Yeah, no worries. The whole point of it is like when we talk about, I'm sorry, now I lost my train of thought, so I'll just trying to collect it real quick. When we talk about transness, it's not getting surgeries. We usually just equate transness with like just having a surgery. There's a lot of misinformation about that. That like being trans requires you to have some sort of medical intervention to get it done. And so when she had the surgery as a kid to change her sex against her will, many people said like, "Oh, that's being trans." And so that's was sort of seen in the negative context, both within the show and by people outside of it. And because people misinterpreted that as being transgender, that's where the anti-trans narratives come from, or many people receiving the show to be anti-transgender. But when we talk about transness and people being trans, the actual biggest thing with that we need to talk about is actually bodily autonomy, which I know is like the buzzword and a lot of things we're talking about when we talk about Roe v. Wade and women and other people who are able to give birth, being able to have access to abortions and things like that. But it also comes in with being trans, because when we talk about people wanting to transition, to asking for different pronouns, for asking for people to perceive them a certain way or be able to wear certain clothes that they want to wear, all that comes down to just being able to control and dictate how our body is seen and how we wish to be perceived in it. And part of that can be surgeries. Like for me, I'm actually, you can see my face is actually a little bit puffy and swollen. I actually just had a surgery on my face that was related to transgender stuff just recently for me. But that was something that I entered into that I had full awareness of, was like told by a doctor, like we had years of going to therapists and talking to people about it. It was a choice that I made because it was to make me happier. And so transness is more about getting to dictate how you see yourself and other people getting to see you, of which surgeries may be part of, but it's not just surgeries. And so that's sort of the distinction between intersex issues and trans issues. But because the show places it into alien metaphor, and you sort of have this sort of added layer of like, oh, we're talking about men and women, and in a Mockulan society, their women are intersex, but in human society they aren't. It sort of adds that layer of confusion on top of all of it.
Yeah. And there's, when you're talking about metaphors and you're talking about stuff like this, most times the intent of the people making them really doesn't matter. It boils down to how it's received.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing that I do want to point out was that if you were to reach out to the show and try to find out what they were trying to say, you would go to their social media, where you would find them retweeting stuff that is very supportive. The interpretations that are very supportive of the trans community, not the other take. And I think that's a pretty clear sign. So when you are talking about the Orville, right? It's not Star Trek, but it is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is. I mean,
it's
kind
actually
of
written by the same people who wrote older, like Brandon Braga, who wrote like Star Trek Voyager and Next Generation, is a writer on this show. So it's literally the same people of older Star Trek, not current modern Star Trek.
Right. I mean, it's very much. I mean, it really does seem like the same universe, and that crosses into, Star Trek. This isn't the first time in this particular genre that you have people seeing a metaphor for trans people, like with the DS9, right? Is that so? When you're talking about affecting social change, how important do you see shows like this when that metaphor comes out, even though, as we just saw, it's not always received the way you would hope it would be? Do you think that it's helpful?
I think it's extremely helpful for a myriad of different reasons, but there are positives and negatives. But the positives I think are incredible, especially at a time where like older Star Trek is being produced, where a lot of these issues couldn't get on screen. And so, I mean, even on older Star Trek, you had producers of those shows when writers are like, "Hey, can we have actual like human LGBTQ characters?" They were told no. But then they could have episodes where they were like, let's have Jessie Dax, who's one of my personal favorite characters, talk about being a woman who used to, through alien weird stuff going on, used to be a guy, and characters even calling her old man as a sort of term of endearment and just sort of like a friendship bond between them. But she would bring that up all the time. And that allowed a lot of people to see like transgender issues being discussed through that. And then also for me, I was a little kid growing up loving Star Trek and not getting to see trans stuff. I loved Dax because I got to see myself in her. And that just like meant so much to me. And it gave me ability to like talk and think about what I was feeling in a way that I couldn't really articulate before. So I think for those reasons, it's supremely helpful. And even when we get to something like the Orville and older stuff in general, I think what is so great about using allegory and metaphor like this is it allows people to sort of take their biases out of our current politics today and put them in a context that's completely separate from what we're dealing with and allow people to just analyze from the outside, like, oh, this is what is going on here. These are the feelings going on here. These are the feelings that these people are expressing. And this is how maybe these bigotries and prejudices may be enacted, and get to like analyze them and be like, oh, I see how that fits where I'm at. But it allows the guard to go down because they're not saying in like terms of like Democrat versus Republican or the left versus the right. They don't have those terms that they have to put it into. And so it allows them to sort of not see that adversarial relationship with the discussion, but just a discussion about it. I think that that's really powerful. However, the negative does come in to the fact, I think in twofold, is one, it does tend to be up to the biases of the people writing the show. I mean, older Star Trek, for example, was written mostly by a lot of non-transgender people. And so a lot of the metaphors that they used to talk about LGBTQ stuff and trans stuff was often filtered through those lenses. And there were biases that were present. Like, for example, there was an LGBTQ episode of Next Generation that was like even talking about pronouns and things way back in the early 90s, which was amazing. But it still ended on a story that like had the character get her mind erased at the end. That in a way almost confirms like conversion therapy, which we know is like a harmful thing that LGBT people can be forced into. Kind of almost says that that works, which it doesn't. It just sort of pushes people into feeling more suicidal and depressed. So there are those biases that are present. And when we come to the Orville, we see that here because you can sort of see like there's misinterpretations. It's not exactly clear. I think the current episode of Tale of Two Topas does a great job at expressing these issues. But because the earlier episodes also intermixed it with gender issues, intersex issues, when we get to talking about trans stuff, it gets a bit confusing because it isn't so direct. And then the other problem with metaphor sometimes is that it's otherizing. As much as I love Dax, I adore her with all my heart. I only got to see myself as an alien. I never got to see myself like being a full person. And so while that's great to teach other people about what trans people are, and even teach trans people about ourselves, it doesn't let us get to be seen as like, oh, we can actually exist as human beings and not just aliens. So those are some of the positives and negatives of allegory.
Right. I would imagine that, I mean, you don't get the representation that you, yeah. I mean, I can definitely see that. So what about Garrick?
Garrick, oh my God. Garrick is fascinating. So Garrick, I could go down a whole rabbit hole. I mean, if you watch Garrick, I love how you just say that and I know what you're talking about. Garrick was a character who I love way back in Deep Space Nine, and he was actually performed in the initial episodes of the show as a gay man. Like he literally goes up to Bashir and like propositions him for lunch. And it's very clear if you watch that early scene that he's like, I find this dude hot and I kind of want to ask him out. And that is pretty explicit. However, the show never actually stated it. And actually, there was an interview done with the writer of the show, Ira Stephen Bear, and he actually made a point that like they never asked if they could make Garrick explicitly gay. Like they never even asked if they could make him that. And so a lot of people, because it was never stated and it was just sort of like these undertones, that many people missed that fact that that's how he was played by the actor. And then as the show went along, because it was never stated or made explicit, you saw a lot of storylines that started to be shifted where they started putting Garrick in relationships with women. And they could kind of now change it so to be like, make it the show more heterosexual, if you want to put it that way, because it was never actually stated. And I'm a huge nerd, so I know a lot about behind the scenes. There's a whole bunch of stories about maybe some producers on the show that were possibly homophobic, that were pushing them to not go that route. And so that's when we talk about like explicit representation versus like coding of characters, where you have characters that are coded one way, And that's great. And you can find maybe representation in that, but it allows people to miss it who don't necessarily aren't aware of that, that aren't looking for that, who aren't aware of LGBTQ issues. But also, it also allows people to sort of change it if they wish to, if it's not exactly stated.
Right, right. Um, that's actually he one of my favorite characters,
Oh,
like
he's
in all of sci-fi.
he's
Like,
great. Every scene he's in, I just like, oh yeah, this is gonna be a good episode.
so the Orville as a whole, what do you think of it? Is it worth watching?
I think so. To be honest with you, I'm deeply impressed with this season. Like I was up and down on it in previous seasons. I liked elements of it, but I did feel a little bit like kind of the Seth MacFarlane Family Guy. Like here's jokes every 2 seconds, and they're half of them are okay, none of them are super great. And I also found some of the episodes to be a little bit redundant of Next Generation because the show's clearly in that style. So I would watch and be like, this is the same episode as that one. Like I saw Data doing the same thing. Um, but these past few episodes of this season 3, I've been actually, for the most part, been like, wow, they're tackling some really good issues. Like I think they talked about how harassment leads to suicidal thoughts in the first episode. They talked about abortion issues in recent episodes. Talked about religious orthodoxy and how that can sort of influence politics as well. Even election stuff, which from like 2016 election issues they discussed. I was like, wow, they're actually like they're really pushing it forward. So I recommend it. I think it's imperfect, but no show is. So
Yeah, I mean, when I have to be honest, like when I first was like, okay, well, I'll sit down and watch all of these. That first episode, I was just like, yeah, this is.
hmm
I really wish I hadn't already committed myself in my mind to doing this, but it did. It got a lot better from where I'm sitting. So as far as sci-fi in general, when you're talking about things that move society forward, that help build that better world, what what episodes or movies or books do you think provide the better allegories, the better metaphors, the things that you could subtly introduce to people and hope that they get the message?
Mm. I would actually give you two things because one I think will be an interesting contrast. Um, I personally, actually, I'll give you three real quick. Personally, I like modern. I know it's been kind of a hit or miss for a lot of people. Modern Star Trek, I think, does a really good job at kind of in the opposite way to the Orville, having more literal representation. I do think modern Star Trek sometimes fails when they talk about like delving into like the metaphor and like the like getting into the hard hitting issues, and they sometimes become more action adventure. But what I do like about modern Star Trek is they do have a lot of actual transgender, LGBTQ, people of color, on people like characters, human characters on the show. And it's just like letting people exist authentically. And you can tell the show's gone out of its way to not just use people as like a tool for learning, but just letting people exist as themselves. And I think that that's absolutely wonderful. I think that getting to see like trans people be a queer camp over the top villain in a recent episode of Strange New Worlds, I think is fun. So there's that. I think the best science fiction show, though, that I have seen of the past few years by far is The Expanse. If you have not watched The Expanse, it is the best way I could pitch it is it's like Game of Thrones before Game of Thrones got bad, but in space. And it does such a great job of um, talking about kind of that same thing where we're talking about politics today, but placed into a really complex web of politics and uh, cool action, things like that. So the basic plot of that show, just a quick pitch it, is you have Earth and Mars, which are kind of at war with each other. It's like a kind of a Cold War. Mars has become more of a militaristic organization, very nationalistic. They're trying to terraform Mars, and so they're always like, "Yeah, we're the hard, like bite our knees down, and we'll get this done," sort of people. And then Earth's become more of this society where like they have plenty of abundance, they have a ton of resources, they can do whatever. And then in between, you have these people called the Belters who live in space and have lived in space for generations now, who don't have a centralized government, kind of feel displaced and dispossessed, and have started forming different kind of terrorist groups, kind of like the IRA in Ireland, to sort of fight back and push back. And the show just talks about the complexity of all of that. There's no villains or heroes. It's just sort of like they're all sort of dealing with the complex ramifications of this. And I think it really smartly talks about bigotries, harassment, how politics plays into all of that, how people manipulate it. It's very good. Um, and then my final one that I'll give you, if you're looking for just a show that feels positive and just takes delight in the future and diversity of humanity, while it's not necessarily a future set show, it is a science fiction show set today, and that's called Sense8. And it's made by the same people who made The Matrix. And it is just a show that is full of joy and happiness, and it's got a fun like action adventure plot. They're trying to take down this evil corporation thing, but the show is more just about these people being diverse people getting to interact and have fun with each other, and taking enjoy and just getting to know and be with each other. And it centers around 8 people who are able to jump into their bodies and thoughts, and share skills with each other. And they jump around the world and helping each other deal with their problems. So you'll have like a cop in Chicago be able to help out a businesswoman in Japan, dealing with things there, and sort of her kung fu skills then help someone else in Nigeria. And it's just a really cool sort of sci-fi story about like how we all relate to each other, even despite our vast cultural and political differences.
Cool. Okay. So is there anything that you want to touch on that you don't think we did?
No, that was pretty much it. Thank you for dealing with my long-winded rants. I tend to be a very long-winded person, so
No, it's good. No, that's really kind of what I was hoping for, because again, it's that thing that happens every once in a while. You make that video, you look at somebody else's, and you're like, man, mine was horrible. So this is exactly what I was hoping for. Plug your stuff. Tell everybody who you are again, where they can find you, all that stuff.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. It's an honor, honestly, to talk to you. You say you like, oh, my video wasn't great. Your videos are wonderful, and I adore them. So thank you for that. As for me, you can find me at Jessie Gender on YouTube. That's where I do sort of my main stuff. And like I said, if you liked me talking about these issues, that's a lot of what I do on the channel. I think probably my 2 videos most recently that would be akin to this discussion would be, I did a video on sex in Star Trek: The Next Generation, which is a very long video, but it's meant to be watched in chunks, where I sort of talk about the history of Star Trek: The Next Generation, go into the nitty gritty of the behind the scenes, and talk about both the issues and problems, but also what they got right when it came to talking about LGBTQ issues, talking about gender, talking about sex, talking about men versus women and the treatment of men versus women on screen and behind the scenes. And then I also have a video recently talking about director James Gunn, who, if you know him, he directed like Guardians of the Galaxy and the recent Suicide Squad movie. And it was a video about how throughout his work, James Gunn has tried to de-radicalize his own sort of sense of masculinity, in the sense that he sort of saw himself like having to need to be tough and strong, and that sort of hurting him and leading him to go and to be abusive and feeling depressed and drunk and overusing drugs a lot of the time. But then how he used his films to express a lot of those feelings and break them down and try to form a new version of manhood and masculinity through that. And I think it was it's a wonderful look, I think, at just how he's done that. So those are 2 videos. If you're like nerdy stuff, that's sort of what I do. And yeah, that's pretty much me.
All right. Did you say the name of your channel?
Yes, Jessie Gender. So
Okay.
if you type in Jessie Gender, you'll find it. You'll see my face on there. So
okay. All right. Well, I guess that's it. I hope that answered everybody's questions. We kind of hit on everything that was one of the questions I've written down here. Mm-hmm. So I hope that covered what people wanted to know from somebody who definitely has a better take. And I guess that's it. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's just a thought. Y'all have a good day.